Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. This is the one where I can finally show you the Ryzen benchmarks. Now, if you haven't already skipped ahead, just give me a moment to go over a few things before we jump to the good stuff. As I mentioned earlier in the week, my Ryzen testing hasn't exactly gone to plan, and even now I'm not 100% confident everything's functioning as it should be. I either got a bad board initially, the board that I was using, the Asus Crosshair. It kept breaking SMT support, definitely wasn't boosting correctly, and I had a lot of trouble with memory compatibility as well. In short, I wasted most of the time I had for testing. The first 3 days I was just trying to work out bugs and troubleshoot the board, and any results I did gather during that time were ultimately thrown out because they were inaccurate. During that time, I learnt that in order to extract the most performance out of Ryzen, the Windows power profile needs to be changed from the default balance profile to the high performance profile. Doing so ensures that the Sense MI Pure Power and Precision Boost technologies have the ability to respond to varying workloads as quickly as 1 millisecond. The balance profile permits the operating system to request which P state to use, which typically takes up to 30 milliseconds. Selecting high performance completely hands control over from the operating system to the processor, allowing for better control. I found this led to at least a 5% boost in performance, and at times gains as much as 15% were seen, so it's important users are aware of this and make the change. Of course, with a brand new platform with a radically new CPU architecture, some teething issues are bound to pop up. For the most part, it seems like I was a bit unlucky and wound up with a motherboard that was a bit of a lemon. For testing, I ended up using the ASRock X370 Taishi. The board worked great, though it will probably require a BIOS update or two before it's perfect. I didn't find any memory that would boot successfully using the XMP profile, and since this is an Intel feature, I'm not even sure why it's here. Hopefully we'll see AMD AMP make a comeback. Finally, I'm still not convinced that on any of the motherboards I have, the Ryzen processors are boosting correctly, so keep that in mind. As a side note, for the Intel CPUs, I made sure that any auto overclocking features, such as the enhanced core option, which sees all cores boosted to the maximum turbo frequency under load, were disabled. Right, so I'm not going to talk about Ryzen's architecture, its features, or any of that kind of stuff here. I know most of you simply don't care at this point and just want to see the benchmark results. If you are interested though, check the link for the written version over at techspot.com. For testing, the Titan XP was used to handle any rendering work, but before we get to the games, I'll quickly look at some synthetic benchmarks and application tests. Okay, well we might as well start here, the Cinebench R15 results. This is where the fun began for me, though it quickly became somewhat frustrating. The multi-threaded scorer of 1,624 points for the Ryzen 7 1800X is incredible. AMD advertised 1,601 points, so we're well on track here then. However, AMD stressed that the single thread performance has to be hitting at least 160 points or the CPU isn't boosting correctly. Well, I tried 3 different motherboards while testing, and the best result I got was 154 points on the ASRock X370 Taichi. The ASRock and Gigabyte boards went as low as 148 points in this test, so going forward I'm down around 5% on what AMD claims the single thread performance should be at. For those of you wondering, for the most part my 1800X chip was clocked at just 3.7 GHz for this test, but on occasion briefly jumped up as high as 4.1 GHz. AMD tells me it should be pegged at 1.4 GHz the whole time, so there's definitely some sort of issue here. Temperatures didn't seem to be the issue, as the chip only ran at just over 50 degrees when all cores were active. AMD also tells me that other reviewers have reached and even exceeded 160 points. That said, I know others who haven't, so I'm hoping a future BIOS update can solve the issue. The 1700X also looked mighty impressive when looking at the multi-threaded performance, scoring 1,529 points. The single-thread score came in at 143 points, and that's not bad. That places it just ahead of the Core i7-5960X, and just behind the 6800K. This is also similar to the single-threaded performance of the Ivy Bridge 3770K, for example. So to recap, amazing multi-threaded performance with reasonable single-thread results. It will be interesting to see how much this impacts real-world testing. Before we do that though, let's just check out the memory bandwidth performance, as this is an area where the FX series showed a real weakness. Unfortunately, I was only able to get my setup stable with DDR4 2666 memory, and even that was a bit of a pain to get working. Again, the XMP profiles for all the memory I tried failed, so we had to do things the old-fashioned way and manually set the timings, which isn't really a big deal. I was briefly able to get the system up and running with DDR4 3000 memory and ran a memory test and saw 32GB per second, which is on par with Skylake and Kaby Lake, but unfortunately for the rest of the benchmarks, the system just wasn't stable. Anyway, using DDR4 2666 memory, both Ryzen processors churned out 29GB per second, which is reasonable. Hopefully before too long, memory compatibility and support will improve on these boards, but for now this is the best I was able to do. The last synthetic benchmark that I had time to look at was PCMark's creative test. Here the 1800X produced a very respectable 8,802 points, and while that is lower than the 6700K and 7700K processors, it did outpace the 5960X and 6800K processors. The 1700X was 6% slower, and that did drop it down alongside the 6800K and 6600K processors. Still overall decent results for the Ryzen processors, though admittedly it's hard for me to gauge overall performance from this test, so let's move on. The Monte Carlo simulation is an old favourite, and this heavy Excel workload crushes weak CPUs. The old FX8370, for example, took 5 seconds to complete the workload, and incredibly this means Ryzen is more than twice as fast here. The 1700X beat the 5960X by a reasonable margin, taking just 2.27 seconds. Granted, 300 milliseconds isn't a lot, but it does mean that the AMD processor was 13% faster. The 1800X, of course, was faster again, taking just 2.13 seconds. The fastest desktop processor, which is also by far the most expensive, the Core i7-6950X, is able to complete the test in just 1.7 seconds. Still, the 1800X is mighty impressive. The 7-zip dictionary test sees the 1800X and 5960X go head-to-head, and the result a dead heat. Meanwhile, the 1700X had no trouble outmuscling the 6-core 12-thread 6800K in this test, so another great showing for AMD's new 8-core Ryzen processors. Those of you who spend a good deal of time encoding videos in programs such as Premiere Pro like me will love what Ryzen has to offer. Granted, Premiere is still generally best handled by something like the 7700K overclocked to the max, but here we see the 1800X delivering a truly impressive result. Completing the workload in 585 seconds made it a whisker faster than the 5960X and 9% faster than the 7700K. The 1700X was also impressive, taking just 618 seconds. These really are truly impressive results. Unfortunately though, due to the technical difficulties that hindered my benchmarking progress, these are all the application tests I was able to conduct in time for today's release. Next up, I have 4 games to check out. Having seen such impressive productivity performance, I had high hopes for Ryzen when it came to gaming, and well, the results are interesting. Please note that the gaming graphs are arranged by the minimum frame rate, and the Titan XP was used for testing at 1080p to reduce the GPU bottleneck. So with slower GPUs or more demanding quality settings, the results will even up, and the CPUs that lag behind in these tests will of course look more competitive. Anyway, as expected, Ryzen does indeed trail the Skylake and Kaby Lake processors when it comes to gaming performance, though the margin isn't extremely significant, at least in Battlefield 1. The 1800X looks great for the minimum frame rate, though you can't help but notice the lower than expected average frame rate. Looking at the average frame rate, the 1800X is on par with the Ivy Bridge 3770K. Not a bad result by any means, and it's worlds better than the old FX 8370. Still, we are seeing that when Ryzen 7 isn't fully utilised, its slightly weaker IPC performance can be seen. Meanwhile, the 1700X matched the minimum frame rate of the 5960X, though the average frame rate was only similar to the Sandy Bridge 2600K. Coming from the reasonably good Battlefield 1 performance, I was pretty disappointed with the results seen when testing with Gears of War 4. Here the 1800X struggled to keep pace with the Ivy Bridge 3770K, while the 1700X was again similar to the 2600K. Not a terrible result, and the minimum frame rate was still decent. Still, this is an early indication that gamers rocking high refresh rate monitors will probably want to stick with a Core i7 processor. The Overwatch bot test is very demanding, and in the past we've seen Core i5 processors struggle to keep up with the hyper-threading enabled Core i7s. So where does Ryzen fit in? Well, right in the middle when looking at the minimum frame rate. Again, the average frame rates aren't that impressive, as the Ryzen processors obviously aren't allowing the Titan XP to hit the same heights. Still, the performance was a massive step up from the FX 8370, and the minimums were a good bit higher than those Sandy Bridge and Ivy Bridge Core i7 processors. The last game that I had time to test was Watch Dogs 2, and this was an important title to include, I felt. Here, CPU utilization hovered between 70 and 80% on the Ryzen processors. What's more is the loading was even across all 16 threads. Yet despite that, it didn't put away the 8-threaded Core i7 processors like the 5960X did. In fact, they were a good bit slower here, at least when compared to the 6800K, 6700K and 7700K. They did manage to outperform the Haswell and Ivy Bridge Core i7s, and of course all the Core i5 processors. So again, not a bad result here, but I honestly did expect to see better results in a game that can load up to 16 threads quite heavily. Right, so time to overclock. I squeezed all this in last minute, but having spoken with a few other reviewers, I feel like I've been able to get the most out of these processors. AMD suggests that 4.2 GHz with the 1800X should be possible at an incredible 1.45 volts. That said though, they don't recommend this voltage for daily use as it will reduce the lifespan of the processor. They suggest 1.35 volts for daily driving, but didn't mention the clock speed you should be able to achieve at that voltage. Anyway, my 1800X wasn't stable at 4.2 GHz using 1.45 volts. Instead, 4.1 GHz was the limit, and I could leave the voltage on auto here. The motherboard appeared to be boosting the voltage to around 1.35 volts when under load. The 1700X unfortunately didn't make the 1.4 GHz that the 1800X did, and was instead limited to 3.95 GHz. Speaking with Brian over at Tech City for the past few days, he also found 3.95 GHz to be the limit for his 1700X chip, and he spent quite a bit more time than I did trying to push it further, so I'm confident this is the end of the road, at least when air-cooled. Most of the overclocking was done at the BIOS level. However, AMD does have a very cool utility on offer called AMD Ryzen Master. This Windows-based overclocking software tool works extremely well, and it's easy for novice users to play around with. Adjusting the clock multiplier for all the cores or individual cores can be done quickly on the fly, while changing memory settings or disabling cores will require a reset. The overclock pushed the 1800X to a multi-thread score of 1,701 points, which is an impressive score. Though this is only a mild 5% performance bump, which is less than what I should have received. Given the clock speeds, a score of more like 1800 points would have been in line with what I was expecting. Finally, the 1700X enjoyed a 10% performance boost with a score of 1,687 points. Here we see that the 7-zip performance of the 1800X has been increased by 6%, while the 1700X found an additional 9% performance. That puts the overclocked 1700X ahead of the stock 1800X, and as you might have expected, well ahead of the 4.9 GHz 7700K. All you Excel buffs watching are going to love an overclocked Ryzen 7 CPU. Prepare to organise and manipulate data at a rate previously unimaginable for $500 or less. Overclock, the 1700X matches the 5960X, while the 1800X almost completes the workload in 2 seconds flat. Overclock, the 1700X boosts the minimum frame rate by 6% to match the performance of the stock 1800X. Meanwhile, overclocking the 1800X only increased the minimum frame rate by 4%. Still, when looking at the minimum frame rates, the 1800X is still very impressive. It's just a shame I couldn't extend the average a little further. Out of the box, the 1700X consumes a similar amount of power to that of the 5960X, while the 1800X is quite a bit hungrier. Overclock, the total system consumption for the 1700X was 220 watts, and that was almost a 30% increase for what was up to a 10% boost in performance. Meanwhile, the overclocked 1800X pushed total system power consumption up by almost 20% to 284 watts. For some reason, the Ryzen processors consumed maximum power in the Excel test, whereas the Intel processors don't. Therefore, comparing the power consumption using Prime 95 gives more balanced results and makes the 1700X and 1800X look considerably more efficient. Here we see that out of the box, the 1800X consumes slightly less power than the 1600K, while the 1700X was similar to that of the 6800K and older 4790K. Using the supplied Noctua NH-U12E SE AM4 cooler, I saw very respectable temperatures on the Ryzen 7 1800X processor. The chip idled at just 35 degrees, and under full load using a burn-in test it peaked at just 53 degrees. At first I thought the motherboard or software might have been reporting incorrectly, but after 40 minutes of load the heatsink was barely warm to touch. Testing was conducted with an ambient room temperature of 21 degrees. Right, so the results are in, though admittedly, compared to the testing I normally like to do, I feel like this is a bit of a preview really. So while I didn't include nearly as many games and applications as I would have liked for a release day video, I will be following this video up shortly with a more in-depth test covering something like a dozen games, or probably more than a dozen games, at 1080p and 1440p. That said, I am very keen to check out other day one reviews to see the kind of results they got. I'm pretty sure my application results are on where they should be, but for the gaming that isn't using all the cores or all the threads, I think there may be a bit of a boost issue there that's holding me back a little bit. And if that is the case, I will work quickly to solve that issue. I'm already working on it with AMD now because they think there's more to be had. So it'll be interesting to find out. I've done everything I can at this point. Having said all that though, I do feel like the testing included still paints a very interesting picture. When it comes to productivity and content creation, the Ryzen 7 CPUs are extremely impressive. The Premiere Pro and Excel performance was incredible, and it really got me hyped up for the gaming performance. Unfortunately, while certainly not bad, the gaming performance was somewhat of a letdown. We always knew that this was one area where Ryzen might struggle against the Empire, so results, while a little disappointing, aren't entirely surprising. For the most part, AMD had only shown off Ryzen's gaming capabilities at the 4K resolution using a Pascal Titan X, and we all know this isn't how you test CPU gaming performance. This merely imposes a GPU bottleneck that virtually eliminates any impact the CPU might have on performance, within reason anyway. One thing I did notice is that all the games I have looked at so far, which is considerably more than the 4 shown in this video, were all incredibly smooth on the Ryzen processors. GTA 5, for example, plays very well on the Core i7-7700K, but every now and then a slight stutter can be noticed. The 1800X in comparison was as smooth as silk, and not once did I spot any kind of stuttering. I found a similar situation when testing Battlefield 1 as well. Performance was incredibly smooth with the Ryzen processors, while every now and then the quad-core 7700K had a small hiccup, though admittedly, this didn't happen often, but it's still every now and then you noticed a quick little stutter, and this was something that I never ever saw when playing for quite some time on the 1800X and 1700X. Still, as smooth as the experience was using a Ryzen 7 processor for gaming, I feel that those running high refresh rate monitors are probably still going to be best served by something like a high-clocked Core i7-6700K or 7700K. I imagine many of you are looking at the gaming performance shown here and a bit disappointed with the results. They might not be as strong as we had hoped, but they are highly competitive, and it should see the Ryzen 5 and 3 series deliver extremely competitive gaming performance. Also worth noting is that we are testing extreme gaming performance here with the Titan XP at 1080p. Ryzen does look more competitive at 1440p, and will certainly appear far more competitive with something like a GTX 1070 or Fury X handling the rendering work, so keep that in mind. Also worth keeping in mind is that although the extra cores aren't particularly useful in today's games, they could be very useful in the future. How far into the future though, I don't really know. My crystal ball is currently down for maintenance. The only other letdown was the overclocking, but again, like the gaming performance, this was something we weren't expecting Ryzen to deliver. I was only able to hit 4.1 GHz with my 1800X, and even that took quite a bit of trial and error. Sadly, the 1700X couldn't even reach 4 GHz. Still, the gains for the 1700X were decent, and at 20% more affordable, this is the processor I would buy. That said, I have no idea how well the vanilla 1700 overclocks, but I will be getting one next week. I am aware that some reviewers got them for today's release, so chances are you can already find out how well these chips clock. Power consumption was a bit higher than expected. Our Excel figures are similar to those when using a power bug program like Prime 95, for example. When gaming, Ryzen should be more efficient, and I'll look into this in another video shortly. At the end of the day, when you consider what AMD was coming from, and look at what they have achieved with Ryzen, it's nothing short of amazing. I'm personally very excited to see AMD delivering a competitive high-end CPU, and it shall be very interesting to see how well they can refine the Zen architecture over the coming years. We know that Intel has hit somewhat of a development wall, if you will, so this may afford AMD the chance to catch up even further. Of course, the good news for consumers in all this being that with the added competition, Intel has already started to adjust their pricing across the board, and I expect to see more of this as AMD turns up the heat further with their 6-core and 4-core Ryzen CPUs. For now, I do have a heap more testing to do, and I'll be aiming to deliver those results in a video early next week, assuming there's nothing seriously wrong with my test setup. I now have a few new BIOSes for the boards that I have in hand, so I'm going to apply those straight after I edit this video, and start checking out if that helps with the Cinebench single thread score. I'm really hoping it does. Hopefully after a bit more testing I can give you guys my picks and more of a concrete opinion on Ryzen. With that, I'm going to get back to the benchmark grind. I'm your host Steve, and hopefully I'll catch you next week for more Ryzen action, and I might even check out the GTX 1080 Ti while I'm at it. See you guys.